Good morning, everyone. I am starting now officially. Welcome to the Interparliamentary Dialogue of the 5th ParlAmericas Parliamentary Network on Climate Change, organized in collaboration with the Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and the Senate of Mexico. I'd like to share a few notes before we start. I would like to inform you that this meeting is being interpreted in English, Spanish, and French. To access the interpretation, please select the globe icon and choose English. We would also be grateful if you could please ensure that your name is correct and indicate your country. This will help us in the discussion period later on. Buenos días a todas y todos.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Interparliamentary Dialogue of the 5th Gathering of Climate Change of ParlAmericas, organized in collaboration with the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago and the Senate of Mexico. Before we start, I'd like to share two short notes. This meeting has English, Spanish, French interpretation. To access interpretation, we invite you to select the globe icon and select the language for Spanish. We would appreciate if you could verify that your name is written correctly and indicate your country. This will help us a lot in the period of the dialogue later.
Au dialogue interparlementaire de la 5e rencontre du réseau parlementaire pour le changement climatique, organisé en collaboration
The instructions given participation of Trinidad and Tobago and Mexico. I'd like to indicate that we have interpretation in Spanish, English, and French. So you can access the interpretation below on your screen. Check for your name to be correctly written. That will help us later in the dialogues.
Speaker of the House of Representatives of Trinidad and Tobago and Vice President of ParlAmericas to give us some welcome remarks.
Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo, President of the Senate of Trinidad and Tobago. Senator Nancy de la Sierra, Representative of the Senate of Mexico. Senator Rosa Galvez of Canada, the Vice President of ParlAmericas Parliamentary Network on Climate Change for North America. Legislators of the various jurisdictions here gathered. Dr. Enrico Bota, Coordinator of the Green Growth and Global Relations Division, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Ms. Claudia DeWint, Founding Partner and CEO of the Inter-American Institute on Justice and Sustainability. Ms. Samantha Smith, Director, Justice Transition Center, International Trade Union Confederation. The young YWIL graduate from Antigua and Barbuda, specialist observers, parliamentary clerks, technocrats, and staff of ParlAmericas. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. It is a distinct privilege for me to bring welcoming remarks in my twin capacities of Vice President of ParlAmericas and as the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago at the opening of the 5th gathering of the Parliamentary Network on Climate Change, entitled Addressing Inequalities to Enable Climate Ambition. As you know, this parliamentary dialogue is being co-hosted by the Senate of Mexico, and I particularly recognize Senator Nancy de la Sierra and the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, which collaboration in itself presents an almost perfect geographic picture of the Caribbean and Latin American region, with Trinidad and Tobago being located at the south of the Caribbean island chain and Mexico located to the north of Latin America. As the Speaker of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, I extend my sincere appreciation to the Senate of Mexico for partnering with us to host this timely event, which is particularly critical for the islands of the Caribbean, as we are only 4 days into the hurricane season, which runs from June 1st to November 30th. Those among us from the Caribbean know only too well that the frequency and intensity of the storms increase with every passing year. In the face of the growing climate crisis, and among other global issues, it is imperative that we change our current trajectories, undaunted by the climate skeptics who, as incredulous as they may appear, continue to doubt the science and the consequences of this particular crisis. In the words of Dr. Stephen Hawking, renowned physicist and author, and I quote, "One can see from space how the human race has changed the earth. Nearly all of the available land has been cleared of forests, and it is now used for agriculture or urban development. The polar ice caps are shrinking and the desert areas are increasing. At night, the earth is no longer dark, but large areas are lit up. All of this is evidence that human exploitation of the planet is reaching, and I would say has reached, a critical limit. But human demands and expectations are ever increasing. We cannot continue to pollute the atmosphere, poison the ocean, and exhaust the land. There isn't any more available." I end quote. If the above details are not compelling or sufficiently jarring, according to the World Bank, since the hand of the pandemic has been upon us, an increasing number of countries are facing growing levels of acute insecurity across the global issues spectrum. Climate change has been a buzzword since the 1970s, with the initial focus being centered on global warming and the atmospheric impacts caused by greenhouse gas emissions. By the way, the scientific assumptions on this first surfaced in the year 1824. That awakening summoned calls for the adoption of a world philosophy of environmental responsibility. And while many leading voices could be heard reciting the familiar statement attributed to Chief Seattle, which we all know, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And despite mounting scientific evidence supporting the threat posed by climate change to our very existence, it took over 40 years for the world to arrive at COP21 and the Paris Accord. Admittedly, much attention has since been placed on preserving the atmosphere, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and promoting greener, cleaner energy. Legislation has been passed in some countries, such as Mexico and in Colombia. Partnerships have been formed with international donor agencies to support capacity building and for the creation of specialized green economy projects like in Haiti, Jamaica, and St. Lucia. All our countries have devised strategies, policies, and programs. In my own country, Trinidad and Tobago, we have been making some progress in renewable energy and energy efficiencies. Our nationally determined contributions aims to decrease carbon emissions by 15%, which includes reduced greenhouse gas emissions from power generation, transportation, and industrial sectors by December 31st, 2030. Hydrogen is currently being explored as a clean fuel, and funding was recently sourced to conduct feasibility studies on our becoming a producer of hydrogen. It is expected that shortly, 1,112.2 megawatts of renewable energy shall be delivered to the electric grid, and this will contribute 8.6% of the 10% target for new renewable energy for power generation. Last month, May 2021, one of our leading gas companies joined the Global Oil and Gas Methane Partnership to enable that company to accurately track and reduce its methane output from its production. It is expected that a knowledge sharing facility with that partnership shall be accessible to other local companies in the energy value chain to reduce emissions in their own operations. We are also simultaneously targeting the education of our citizens and building their awareness of their carbon footprint. Last year, a free energy efficiency app was launched for use by citizens on their smart devices. This serves as an energy consumption calculator, cost savings monitor, and as an indicator of one's carbon footprint. A campaign was also launched to distribute free of charge 1.6 million LED bulbs to 400,000 households across the country. And this was launched in September 2020. And in December, we commenced the establishment of vehicle charging stations for electric and hybrid vehicles. While these are laudable efforts, there's no room for relaxation, as a greater thrust is needed to diversify into clean and renewable energy sources, such as kinetic, solar, and wind. According to the World Resources Institute, since the Paris Agreement of 2015, the world is not yet fully on track to limit global warming enough to prevent its most dangerous impacts. From the Institute's preliminary assessment, the world needs to ramp up the adoption of renewables 6 times faster, phase out coal power 5 times faster, transition to electric vehicles 22 times faster, urgently halt worsening deforestation, and accelerate adaptation action and support in order to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. For those voices which bring forth the financial cost argument to justify the modest advancements, there is undeniable evidence that bold climate action could yield a direct economic gain. The Global Commission on the Economy and Climate estimates that bold climate action could generate $26 trillion in economic benefits through to 2030. This is not wishful thinking or unsubstantiated information. The Financial Times on October 2nd, 2020 reported that the world's largest solar and wind power generators surpassed ExxonMobil in stock market value. Next Era Energy, a Florida-based utility and power producer, had a market capitalization of $138.6 billion in intraday trading, having gained more than 2/3 in value in the past 2 years, according to Standard & Poor's Global Market Intelligence. Although switching to clean energy and clean economy could lead to over 65 million new low carbon jobs, higher global GDP, increase in female employment, and labor participation, it could also raise $2.8 trillion in carbon price revenues and fossil fuel subsidy savings to reinvest in public priorities. But a discussion on climate change and the requirement for bold action is not just limited to greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy efficiencies, and greening the economy as ends in themselves. We must consider the social impacts of climate change events. And all of us gathered here as legislators, in one way or the other, have come familiar with the terms of La Nina and La Nina, excuse me, and El Nino, those two weather patterns. The vulnerabilities of small island development states to rising sea levels, increases in the incidence of flooding, increasing in the frequency and intensity of storms, hillside erosion, loss of coastline to erosion, and as a result of changing weather patterns and rising temperatures, and the consequential negative impact on health and life, infrastructure, habitats, agriculture, ecosystems, and tourism stocks are well documented. In previous conversations in the space provided by ParlAmericas, we have explored the Sendai framework of disaster risk reduction, and we have been presented with an invaluable tool in the publication of the Parliamentary Protocol for Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change Adaptation, which provides guidance to us in our various roles as legislators as we confront the potential social impacts of climate change to our constituents. However, discussions on and policies to address climate change are incomplete if they do not recognize that there is a symbiotic relationship between climate change and inequality. To effectively address climate change through climate action, we must address all systemic inequalities, including ethnic, economic, gender, access to decision-making, and disabilities. Because the impact of climate change is not universally experienced by our constituents. Conversely, in attempting to reduce inequalities as dictated by SDG 10, we must address climate change as its impacts not only entrenches, but deepens existing gaps of the disadvantaged or the vulnerable groups. Researchers Islam and Winsell, in their study, Climate Change and Social Equality, which was published in 2017, developed a framework for assessing what they termed as the vicious cycle which climate change creates for the disadvantaged or the marginalized. They are positive that inequality reduction can help in climate change mitigation. That framework shows that 1, the disadvantaged or marginalized are more exposed to climate risks. 2, the disadvantaged or marginalized are more likely to suffer disproportionately the consequences of climate damage. And 3, the disadvantaged or marginalized are less able to cope with and recover from losses suffered. As legislators, we already know that there are a plethora of reasons for climate action. We are well familiar with the international frameworks to which our respective countries have been signatories, the Paris Accord, the Sendai Framework, and Agenda 2030, to name a few. As legislators, we subscribe to the commitment of making the lives of our constituents better. We acknowledge, as expressly stated in Agenda 2030, our unique role as actors to realize the laudable 17 distinct but intimately intertwined goals for a more just, equitable, inclusive, harmonious, peaceful world in which no one is left behind. This interparliamentary dialogue is intended to better equip us to discharge that unique role. Guided by the insights, expertise, and experience of our guest panelists, we will explore the relationship between social inequality and climate change, how these two issues negatively impact and exacerbate each other and prevent the positive development of each. We will also examine strategies to incorporate an intersectional approach to the development of climate policies and to promote a just transition towards a green, inclusive economy. I reiterate that we do not have the luxury of inaction. In the words of Shivrat Rampal, QC, and I quote, "If you stand still while the world changes around you, you will cease to be where you are relative to everything else, and almost certainly to your detriment," end quote. Once again, I extend my appreciation to the Senate of Mexico, with whom we are honored to co-host this gathering, along with ParlAmericas. And I expect that we shall enjoy a very engaging and productive discussions this morning. I thank you.
Thank you, Speaker Anisette George, for starting to lay the foundation for this dialogue today. I would like to next invite Senator Nancy de la Sierra from Mexico, Secretary of the Senate Board and President of the Special Committee on the Monitoring of the Implementation of the 2030 Agenda in Mexico, and co-host for today's event. Please, Senator, the floor is yours.
Gracias, muy buenos días.
Thank you. Good morning. Good afternoon in some places. Distinguished parliamentary members. From Mexico, I send you salutations. For me, it's an honor to be with all of you and to be able to speak about this important topic, the climate change. On behalf of the president of the board and co-president of the session of fifth meeting of the climate change of ParlAmericas, Senator Eduardo Ramirez Aguilar, receive cordial greetings. It is an honor to represent my country, Mexico, in this event of high level, along with representatives of the parliaments of 35 countries that make Americas, who share a common history of neighborhood and ties of friendship. I'd like to start by pointing out that the interparliamentary dialogue is pertinent, relevant in the moment for 4 reasons I want to share with you. First place, I consider the climate crisis is one of the greatest global risks, challenges we face. The global temperatures rise up, the climate change deteriorate our planet, as well as the economic impact and serious effects on our health. No doubt, we need to find solution. Secondly, before the context of pandemics, COVID-19, along with the climate change, has become a challenge, global challenge, the biggest one in the history of humanity, with profound repercussion, national in matter of economy, society, and health. We should face this sanitary crisis that has shown us that it is urgent to change our relationship with nature, that sustainability and competitiveness is not excluding factors. The message has been clear. We need to walk towards production models that are sustainable, green economies through the decarbonization of economy, clean economies, renewables, and different consumption ways that are responsible. Third, we are in the path of the Conference of the United Nations on Climate Change, COP26, to be held in November 2021. Will match the 5 years of the Accord of Paris. This will be a relevant moment to ratify our commitment, assume new challenges in the fight with climate change. Fourth, because the 2030 agenda turned 5 years in September 2020. So we are now in the decades of the action for the sustainable development goals. This means that we have less than 10 years for the goals, along with COVID, that is go back. So the objectives goals transversally include the environmental transformation, the fight with the climate change that is stated in the GDS, Action for the Climate. Along this complex context we are living in, the only solution to the global problems is global solution. Multilateral action, diplomacy, and interparliamentary cooperation are fundamental in these times. For sharing these virtual spaces, a step in the route. And of course, we convince ourselves of enriching the actions and strategies implemented by different countries to look for jointly solutions in our region to guarantee the climate safety.
We need to guarantee the climatic safeties, and we are only going to achieve this by working collaterally. That's why the policymakers have to make sure that all of these policies are to be made in order to guarantee a more sustainable future for all people. And from the Americas, we must have this environment, this policy-making environment where we can include all people and where we can have all the objectives of the SDGs in order to listen to all of the needs, because we know that there is a specific relationship between inequities and between the climate change. If it is true that this is a problem that we have at hand, there is a higher risk for those countries that are in a specific vulnerable situation. So that's why we need to pay attention to those vulnerable populations, such as ethnic minorities, such as women, such as poorest populations, and especially in a region that is specific affecting those peoples, and that we need to pay attention to the SDG number 10, where we are going to pay attention to the climatic vulnerability. In order to pay attention to all of these needs, we play a key role as policymakers in order to take care of our planet and to actually guarantee that we are going to comply with these SDGs that we have for the 2030 agenda. And we need to prioritize these issues. Based on this, I'd like to share with you, specifically from what we have previously discussed in our country, we have already made some efforts in order to advance protecting our environment and protecting what we have and what we have done regarding the climate change. So let me just mention some of those policies that we have came to. The first one is that we modified our constitution in order to pay attention to this policy making about the environment and the climate change in order to avoid any pollution or any contamination to our environment. We also work with some of the countries that are here today, that, as you know, this is the acute element in order to have a better governance in our country. We implemented some reforms for the agroforestry policies in our country and for the rationalization, the environmental rationalization. Besides, we also have the environment protection laws that are going to allow us to evaluate the different policies that we have evaluated. We also made a reform, we also reformed our environmental laws in order to control the use of pollutants or the organic contaminants or pollutants that have to do with wildlife in order to transform the designation of the specific spaces in our country in order to have a better understanding and to have a better management of the policy making or the policies that we have in our country. Besides, we also have education, environmental education reforms. Of course, this has to do with the environmental cooperation with the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And as you all know, this is especially important to guarantee the environmental issues, as well as we strengthen the regional cooperation initiatives. And this is going to contribute to reduce the use of paper that has actually given very good results. It is also worth mentioning that Mexico has willingly participated in different forums at the United Nations starting from July last year in order to see how we can comply with this agenda. Finally, I'd like to mention just a couple of things that we have done in order to follow up on the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And we have found that it is priority to continue with all of these efforts with the next government, with the next office, and we need to continue with the circular ecology and with the management of human waste. And also we need to guarantee the water policies so we can preserve it and we can have a better use of it. And also for a better rural development in order to guarantee a transversal development of all of the different commissions that we have in our legislative agenda. To conclude, I'd like to open up the floor by telling you that on the one hand, I think that ParlAmericas and of course our specific countries should promote as a bloc, as a regional club for the COP26, the specific need to recover the sustainability and resilient policies for the 2030 agenda. On the other hand, our parliaments must participate in this COP26 as part of this delegation of stakeholders that need to pay attention to all of the different issues that we can identify from our different countries to actually fight this climate change. It is obvious to say that we need to commit, we need to be engaged with these initiatives. And please remember and be sure that we are open to continue working with the protection of the environment. So together, as the Americas, we can continue to have a better future for the whole region. Thank you very much. And as usual, I'm very happy to be here with you.
And I have great pleasure now to say that we are moving to my favorite part now. As I do ask everyone, if you could please turn on your cameras. You will know this from ParlAmericas. If I were in person, I would be corralling you into a group photo, and I get to do it here on Zoom. So our parliamentarians, you are our panelists, you get to have your cameras on. Please join me in a smile. These are the memories that we will have. I will send this picture to you all. My colleagues are taking the picture. If you could smile with me, I wish we could be in person. And my colleagues will tell me when our pictures are done. It's not quite the same. I know. Soon enough, maybe in a year's time, we can have this in person. Colleagues, are we good with the photo? We have a large group, so.
We are good with the photo.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you, everyone. And so before we move, I will move now to introduce our moderator for today's session. You will recall that ParlAmericas work is very interactive. So please do know that with the panel, there will be then dialogue for our parliamentary colleagues to join in the discussion. Before I get there, though, I do want to say, so we don't forget, a great big thank you to our interpreters for all of their efforts to allow us to have this discussion in 3 languages simultaneously. The moderator for today's session is Senator Rosa Galvez of Canada. She is also the Vice President of the ParlAmericas Parliamentary Network for Climate Change, representing North America. Senator Galvez, I do pass the floor to you to take us through the panel discussion.
Thank you, Alicia. Buenos días. Espero que la salud les acompañe a todos y cada uno de ustedes. Agradezco mucho a nuestros anfitriones.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I would like to extend my gratitude to all of the participants. We are going to discuss the different issues that has to do with the climate change and the importance of having strategic plans that include an intersectional approach as a key role in order to have a more equitative transition that is going to allow us to have more clean jobs for each one of the workers, ensuring that all of the climatic policies are going to help us to have a better and more equitative future. The experts that we have already said that all of those marginalized populations that are marginalized in either aspect, whether political, economical, or any other aspect, are especially vulnerable to the climate change, and to some of those answers, some mitigation answers are there. This is not explained through just one cause. There is not only one reason to explain this, but this is due to different social reasons that are overlapping that we can actually explain, for example, with the gender issues, ethnicity, age, some inabilities, or some things that are affecting their social development in different aspects. This is affecting, or this is demanding from us that we have more sustainable models that do not reply the same dangerous or the same hurtful policies that we have. This intersection that we talk about with the environment is key in order to be effective in terms of times and in economic terms. For example, in 2020 in Canada and in the United States, there were special discussions regarding systematic racism. And within this context, they give a special role to education. In Canada, all the experts started to identify all the different industrial operations that are polluting and its proximity to those ethnic communities. These vulnerable population are usually populated by Black people, immigrants, and some Native people, and they do not have as many resources as they should have in order to advocate for their rights. Therefore, their rights are affected. In Canada, they're starting to work on some policies in order to reduce the negative effects on those vulnerable populations. This issue does not only happen in those countries, but in every single country. And we should be ashamed of that. And there are many risks that we have in the Latin American populations, in the Latin American countries. Here in Canada, we now have a new office for the advocacy of the responsible ethnicity rights or ethnic rights, where we can advocate for the human rights, and we can see how different companies that are working overseas, especially on the mining, hydrocarbons, and textile factories, are working with these specific issues. On the other hand, we know that the climate change affects us, as we have already mentioned throughout this panel, but we know that some people are more affected by it than some others. A couple of years back, there was a study where it said that women especially suffer from some kind of segregation. For example, in China, women are the ones that are in the agricultural sector, and they have a lower income and they have a lesser access to property or to real estate, and they don't have as much access to financial aid. Therefore, women have a greater difficulty to face any kind of challenge they may face. So this climate change approach should be approached in a holistic way. And I'm quite pleased to be here with you today to answer to all of these questions. And therefore we can discuss from our different experiences from each one of our countries. So today we have summoned an experts panel that has very special guests that are going to help us to understand how we can inclusively work on this issue. So without no further ado, I would like to introduce all of the experts that are joining us today. First of all, we have Enrique Bota, who is the coordinator for the OCDE. There we have Claudia De Wind, who is the founding partner and CEO of the Inter-American Institute of Justice and Sustainability. Samantha Smith, Director, Just Transition Center for the International Trade Union Confederation. And finally, Eduardo Uribe Botero, Director of the Energy Group of Bogota. This panel will last 1 hour. We are going to have 2 rounds of questions where I am going to ask one question to each panelist, to whom I would ask you to be very brief so we can take the best advantage of the time that we have. And at the end, you'll have a later remark where we are going to invite some other people to continue with this discussion. And at the end of the panel, we are going to have a Q&A session where all our guests are going to have the opportunity to share their insights or their questions with us. So in order to get started with this first round of questions, I'd like to address Enrique Bota. I'd like to ask Enrique Bota. OECD has already developed some interesting initiatives in order to work on the paradigms and for example, the circular economy and some others. All of these models incorporate intersectional approaches and gender approaches in order to have environmental policies that are inclusive and that are not going to worsen the situation that we have at hand. Having in mind the OECD standpoint, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, I would like you to tell us what are some of the remarks or some of the considerations that we need to pay attention to whenever we're making policies, whenever we are trying to address the climate change in such way that we are inclusive, because we know this is a complex universe and we know that we need to comply with the 2030 agenda and we cannot leave anyone behind. So the floor is yours, Mr. Bota.
Thanks out, Senator Galvez. And also thanks out to ParlAmericas Parliamentary Network for organizing these events, and looking forward to the debate, which promises to be very, very interesting. So I would say that in order to ensure that environmental policy are inclusive, you need to look at three main dimensions. The first one is to look at people as households. The second one is to look at them as workers, and the final one is to look at regions. Of course, all or most persons are both workers and members of an household. Thus, the impacts for them will be the sum of these two impacts. I will talk more about the household perspective, since we have Samantha Smith on the panel, who is a big expert on the issue of the just transition for workers. So at the OECD, we have recently reviewed the evidence on the impacts of air pollution and climate change, which are two key challenges for this region, but for the whole world. And the evidence shows that lower income households, as you mentioned, are more vulnerable to the consequences of these two types of environmental degradation. More vulnerable in terms of negative impacts on their health, but also on the broader well-being. So policies that reduce pollution and climate change will eventually benefit them more. But at the same time, such policies can pose what we call distributional negative effects on certain socioeconomic groups. Let me take the example of taxing carbon emission or increasing energy taxes. These measures help to address both climate change and air pollution, since they target fuel combustion, which is the main driver of both. However, they often have a negative impacts on low-income households in the form of affordability challenges. This is because taxing carbon may increase energy price, and this would affect low-income households more, since they spend a larger portion of their income on these essential goods. Just to give you an example, I saw some recent data on the US, and it shows that in some US states, some households go up to spend up to 12–14% of their income on these essential goods. That's really a lot, spending 14% of your income just for your energy needs. So if the increase in energy price is driven by a new tax or carbon trading schemes, you can put in place a number of measures to mitigate such negative effects. First, we should highlight the role of the broader fiscal policy, which is a key lever for reducing initial systemic inequalities, which is in the end is the starting point of this discussion. Second, a number of studies underline that you can recycle the extra revenues from the energy tax to compensate any negative distribution implication. Basically, just to put in a more concrete terms, you can take the whole extra revenues for the increase in the energy tax, and you take a small portion of these extra revenues to mitigate the impact on lower income households. And this is a quite important element, because study says you need only a portion of the extra revenues. So the other part, the other around 60% of these revenues can be used for other social objectives. Carbon pricing is, the main policy when we talk about addressing climate change and air pollution. But policymakers can use also other type of policies, such as standards and regulation. And these are actually the most common forms of environmental policies. Just to give you an example, we're talking about fuel economy standards for cars, energy efficiency building codes, also the small label we find on your appliances, those energy efficiency standard for appliances. However, the distributional impacts of regulation standards have been studied much less compared to those of price-based environmental policies. So we have much less evidence in literature, and this is a concern because, as I say, these instruments are used much more commonly. And if there are regressive implications, there is no extra revenues you can recycle to mitigate their impacts. I was told to be brief in this initial remark, so let me just spend a few words on the third dimension that I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, the regional dimension. So beyond the household and worker perspective, the regional perspective is also particularly important. The job losses of the green transition are likely to be geographically concentrated. Fossil fuel extractive activities are, of course, located close to the resource you exploit, close to the coal mine, close to the oil and gas field. And there is also some evidence that also other carbon-intensive industries tend to be geographically concentrated in certain countries. If the new green jobs that the green transition is likely to create are not created in the same areas where the jobs are lost, then we might observe a negative impact on certain community. This is a key challenge of the green transition. So in this context, and I will just close it here for these initial remarks, it's very important that policies introduced by policymakers focus also on the regional dimension, the local needs. You need to have investment, skills, and education policies that are adapted to the challenges, opportunities, and the history of the affected communities. And I stop here. Thanks.
Gracias, gracias, Enrico. Mi segunda pregunta va para Claudia.
Thank you very much, Enrico. Now my next question goes to the Claudia De Vint, who works with sustainability. Now, listening to Enrico and paying attention to some of his remarks, I would like to ask you that this institution you work with is connecting transversally human rights and the resolution of conflicts. In the last couple of years, we have seen in Latin America and the Caribbean an increase given the social environmental issues in these countries. So I have two questions for you. If you could characterize these conflicts, how would you characterize these conflicts? And the second question is, how do you think we can shape a new economy in such a way that we can actually come to a solution of these conflicts for those especially vulnerable populations? Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon for all of you. And especially because this is the very first time that I am taking part of this intervention today, I would like to thank and I would like to extend my gratitude to each one of the participants today and to all of my panelists, and specifically to those that came before me. I would like to thank them for having commented on some aspects that are going to facilitate our discussion this morning. First of all, Enrico mentioned something that is very important, which has to do with the distribution. I think that the conflict that we can see in our region has to do with the legacy, a historical legacy that we have received from our history, especially because of the development patterns have evolved in such way and the historical responsibility that we have. If you pay attention, if you remember this correctly, we know that there are 25% that we only are producing the 25% of the pollution all around the world. You have talked about the situation with women, with ethnic minorities and native peoples. And we know that this pandemic has already revealed some issues that we already had. Let's not forget that 21 million people have lost their job in this region. So in terms of natural resources and the resources that we have at hand, just to talk about in economical terms, we know that we are rich. We have 7 of more mega diverse countries, but our problem has to do with distribution. Our problem has to do with access, and our problem has to do with equity in the access to these resources. So the problems that we have within each one of these countries, I can tell that if we check the statistics, We know that more than 3,500 conflicts have already been identified in this region. And most of these conflicts have to do with water, with ecosystems, and Mrs. Galvez, with the behavior of some specific extractive companies, especially those who have to do with fuels, and with the infrastructure, biodiversity, and tourism. Let's say that those are the key areas that are the ones that are generating this conflict that you were mentioning. But if you carefully read the government reports from the United Nations, we know that the strongest impacts have to do with the hydric resources, extreme events, as it has already been mentioned. Now, if we overlap this conflictivity map with the climatic change map, it wouldn't be a surprise that there are some coincidences. And we have these coincidences because we have water, but we do not have this water in those places where we do need to have this water. And we know that it is difficult to achieve or to access this water for those vulnerable populations. And I would also like to say that this also has to do with the rights approach, or with an approach of rights. And we have failed to implement these kind of approaches where we guarantee human rights in that sense. And now, I'm sorry, I almost forgot to answer your second question. So your second question, how can this transition be more inclusive, be fair to all population, to all people? I think that obligations that from this climate change agreement has to have access, or has to provide access as a key element for every single person. And scientists have already identified the importance of equity and fairness. And here we need to talk about environmental justice. This needs to be transversal to every single answer that we may have. Within these conflicts that we see, there is a fight of interests. For example, in the energetic sector, we can see that in some places, in some specific regions or countries, where the efficient use of energy, where they're using solar panels, we can see that there are some issues with the social issues, or the labor issues. And there are some, let's say, there are some issues with establishing what's a priority. So I think that the approach has to be an integral or a very comprehensive approach, and policymakers have a key role on this aspect, because the challenges that we have at hand are multidimensional, and the answers or the response has to be multidimensional too. Well, I know that all of these vulnerable people have to be understood as members of different households or employees, but I also think that they should be understood as people, and therefore we need to apply, or we need to advocate for a comprehensive approach in such a way that the benefits and the obligations is equitative. Thank you very much, Claudia. That's very interesting. And now, in order to continue with this transition, I would like to invite Mrs. Smith from the Fair Transition Institute. And given the nature of your job, your institution has a privileged position where you get to know the different perspectives of workers and also unions regarding the dimension and the scope of the policies that are necessary for a fair transition. So in this specific aspect, I would like to ask you, what are some of the main proposals or considerations that you have and the workers have, and also the unions, in order to guarantee that these policies are responsive to their needs and to their expectations?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Senator, and greetings to the senators, distinguished guests, other and the ParlAmericas staff. Thank you again for the opportunity to chat a bit today. So previous speakers have hit a lot of the most important points about human rights. Labor rights are part of human rights, about distributional impacts, about inequality and some of the structural issues that you're facing in the region. So I think I'll talk a little bit more about the issues specifically for workers against this context of deep structural inequality on a number of dimensions: gender, class, racial and ethnic groups, but also First Nations or tribal peoples in the region, right? So you have inequality along all of these different axes in different countries that are represented in your parliaments. So just to say 2 words about the International Trade Union Confederation, we represent 220 million organized workers in 162 countries and have affiliates, I think, in every country in your region. And the Just Transition Center was set up by ITUC in 2016 as a response to policymaking in the United Nations at the global level. So yes, the Paris Climate Agreement refers to the imperative of the just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs. And that is in turn a reflection of another global agreement that was also reached in 2015 in the International Labor Organization. So the ILO, as you know, is a tripartite body with workers and our unions, employers and their organizations, and governments, and it negotiates global rules on key issues for labor rights. And one of those issues is just transition. So just to say, like, we have these broad rules, more for policymakers than for example, corporations, but definitely for all 3 of the social partners, for unions, for employers, and for governments. We have them at the UN level. And so when we're talking about fulfilling the Paris Climate Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 8, decent work, Goal 10 on climate change, goals on poverty alleviation and gender equality, those are all reflected in the ILO Just Transition Guidelines. And how do we, as workers in our unions, how do we make sure that policy proposals reflect the things that we need? And by the way, some of those things that are part of just transition and part of the demands of workers, they also relate to gender equality, to inclusion, to household distributional impacts, because working class people are the people who are paying big chunks of their bills to energy costs or to transportation costs. We do that through this process of just transition as defined in the UN and at national level in a very large number of countries now. And that's a process which always has workers and unions at the table. So when climate targets are being set, when legislation is being negotiated at the parliamentary level or within the national government or at the regional level, or when we're in collective bargaining with employers, we're at the table negotiating the plans for our jobs, for the sector, but also things that benefit everyone, including many people who are not union members and may never be union members. Some of those things that affect everyone would be, for example, a safety standard at work for COVID. It would be income payments, basic household support payments. They've been so important for informal workers and all of the hundreds of millions of people around the world who lost their jobs in this crisis. And of course, it can also be things that are very specific to groups of workers in aviation or in transport and so on. So just one way that we make sure that our issues get across is that in a just transition, we're actually at the table and we're negotiating those issues. And when governments say that they have done something on just transition, or employers and have a plan for it, but no worker or union has been anywhere near it. We get told about it afterwards. That's not a just transition. Might be something else that's good, but one of the key characteristics of just transition at the UN level is this democratic process of social dialogue that involves unions. One other thing to say about the sort of pure policy side, like what are the things that we're looking for as workers or unions when we are when we're talking to parliamentarians, especially, or to regional governing bodies, or to national administrations. So the first thing is that there are two things you pretty much need for a just transition. One is you need labor and human rights. And without the essential human rights of workers, which are the rights to freedom of association and expression and to effective collective bargaining, you're not going to have a just transition because you don't really have the collective voice of workers. We can't organize to do the thing that we do best, which is to represent the rights and voice of our members. The second thing that you need for just transition is you need fair tax. And this is an equal opportunity problem in all regions of the world. We're in a situation right now with deep structural inequality where both companies and also wealthy individuals are not paying their fair share of tax. And if we are going to fund this big recovery that we need in all countries, if we are going to fund vaccines for everyone, if we are going to create a lot of decent new jobs, some of that is going to require more public investment, and that in turn requires fair tax as a kind of foundation for it. I think those are sort of big picture policy things, really specific policy things. Well, I mean, one thing that parliamentarians can do is you can launch legislation that sets up tripartite national bodies to come up with and to make decisions about just transition measures. So that would be a national regional government body with unions and with employers, where you negotiate and agree the set of measures that you need in order to make sure that, for example, government investments in infrastructure are going to produce a lot of decent jobs, and that those jobs will also go to more people, that they will be we will have more women, more racialized people, more people from First Nations getting those jobs in infrastructure. And there are lots of models for this from different countries. So if people are interested, you can contact me afterwards and I can give you the list of legislation in different countries where this has happened. I think a second really critical thing is actually, as it seems that as we get global vaccination, which is also a goal for the trade union movement, none of us are really safe or healthy until everyone is safe and healthy. There will also be a surge of public and other spending on recovery. And it's really important that public spending creates good jobs, because another main issue that we have seen exposed during the pandemic is that the incredible increase in informality of work, where people don't have proper contracts, where they don't have a workplace, where they're basically employed on an hour-by-hour, day-to-day basis, that has left people in dire poverty with almost no recourse during lockdowns, but also in the face of this massive economic crisis that we are still in. So, trying to ensure that spending on public goods, including spending on care and education and transport, not just roads and buildings, that has labor standards attached to it, is pretty key. I think the last thing I want to say is that, when we think about just transition, we often think about workers who today are working in coal or oil and gas or some part of the energy sector. And it's true, that's a very large part of our work in the Just Transition Centers. We're working with unions in high emitting countries, in high emitting sectors, and the sort of line of fire is the energy sector because it's going through such a rapid transition. But really, if we're going to rebuild regional economies, we're going to do something meaningful about gender equality. We're going to make sure that more people are lifted out of poverty, like all those things we want to do as policymakers, then all jobs need to be good. And that means that also jobs in care, which are often gender segregated, more available to women than say jobs in mining or oil and gas, that also jobs in care need to be high quality jobs and jobs that are family supporting, so that on a household level, you have more opportunities for people to, through work, to lift themselves and their families out of poverty. One of the things we have seen in this crisis is that many, many women have withdrawn completely from their workforce, not because they want to, but because no childcare or elder care is available to them in the crisis. So as we're trying to recover from this crisis, it's going to be really important to do something about that and to create a lot of good jobs. And that's a kind of supporting part of just transition that I think is also really important. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you very much. Gracias, Samantha Smith, por decirnos qué cosa es la transición justa, pero también
What is the just transition, but also what is not just transition. So moving on with the implementation of a project, practical project on just transition, I'd like to ask Eduardo Uribe Botero, Director of Grupo Energía, Bogotá, to tell us about such interesting pilot project carried out by the Climate Strategy Organization, carried out in developing countries, among them Colombia, to add just transition strategies into contributions determined nationally and proposals aimed at COVID. Can you share the generalities of the project and the main conclusions you gathered? Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor for me to be here with you. Indeed, we carried out a study that included 3 countries, Indonesia, Colombia, and Guyana, 3 different countries in geographical location, economy, and culture. But the study showed important coincidences. First, it showed that for the last 20 years, the countries have built an artillery of legislation, regulation towards the mitigation of the climate change, with differences, of course, among countries, but it's been very dynamic. The countries within the task for the last 20 years, nevertheless, in the design process of the policy and regulation, the strategies, the potential external factors the policies can bear on the vulnerable population, let's say, was not in the mind, the agenda of the policymakers. So, of course, as we have mentioned before, the vulnerable population, rural populations, ethnic groups, poor populations are the vulnerable ones in the climate change, but it depends also on the external factors of the policies designed to attend the problems caused by climate change. So in the case of Colombia and many countries similar to Colombia, the 2 most important issues is deforestation, use of soil, and the energy issue, including transport or transportation. Regarding energy, Colombia, for example, coal and oil producer, the impact of energy transition accelerated on labor population is big. Thousands of workers in the industry of coal in Colombia have lost their job in the last months, but many of them are formal workers who work in multinationals who were in Colombia, they exported coal, but there is another mining population of miners who do not belong to any union. They have weak social organizations all along the government. It is not within the radar of the organization or the government and the organizations, and they are vulnerable. In the case of oil, what we find for Colombia is that either the workers and unions and oil organizations, they see that as a problem mid and long term. The coal issue is imminent because the prices fell and a bunch of people stopped working. So speaking about coal and oil, something important is that not only we should be concerned on the lost jobs, but the income the regions stop receiving, those regions, producing regions, due to less taxes and royalties invested before on social investments and projects. Not only the workers lose their job, but the regions are impoverished because there is production links or chains and the local economies. So the less income on royalties and taxes and the loss of jobs within the economic activities that are linked, there is a regional economic depression. That is why it was interesting what Enrico Mota mentioned about the importance of the strategies of just transition be decentralized to recognize the reality of each region that are diverse within a country, enormously diverse. That seemed to me is key. The other issue that is not renewable natural resource, but it's soil and deforestation. There are equity problems. Speaking to leaders of ethnic communities that inhabit collective territories, indigenous Afro-descendant communities that have been given land, those collective territories are lands, forests, and the restrictions are growing. The governments have the ambition to protect the areas, and those areas are on ancestral territories of ethnic communities, imposing restrictions to the economic use of the land. So there is a fear in the communities because the interest for the preservation of the ecosystem could affect their economic rights, traditional rights, and in many cases, those communities, well, in almost all cases, they are not members of a union which protect them. These people are self-employed. They perform sometimes illicit activities, deforestation, illegal mining. So the challenge of these populations who are not organized in unions, they are segregated in extent territories. In some cases, they are involved in illicit activities for the lack of other opportunities. It imposes enormous challenges for the just transition. I will leave it there. I will emphasize on the message that the just transition also must not be thought only due to the individual, for the individuals that can lose their job, but the impact of the transition on entire communities, entire regions, many of the individuals are informal. They don't have a formal relationship with a union or a strong organization. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eduardo. Let us move on immediately with the second round of questions to leave some room for exchange with parliamentarian members. This question is for Claudia de Wind. We started. The question is, we would like to hear on the proposal and the role of the policymakers can have in the context to promote necessary transformations for a sustainable transition that is inclusive and democratic. Thank you very much for the question. I'd like to start by saying that these questions have to be seen, as I said, with a comprehensive transversal look and of distribution justice. Unfortunately, in our countries, there is a marked trend to work in stagnate compartments. I will use the example of the legislation power, not because it is the only case, just for the context we are. The committee that looks for the energy issues in the Senate of the country it is not necessarily seeing climate change, environment, the one that is making decision on infrastructure, that in the end of the day, they have an important impact in what would be the transition. So I believe the standard regarding what we need for the transition for all the powers of state is a high standard that truly has to be addressed as equity look, justice, and access to rights. Other question I believe important in this issue has to do with the dialogue between powers of state. I believe if we think of what has to do with the rule of law, the role of the parliamentary members has to do with the building of laws. I think it is important in the universe of rule of law, the laws be adequate, be implementable. There is no gap to be made with participation, the resources be there to be implemented. We have a trend currently where the judicial powers are making important decisions on climate justice, filling legislation gaps due to the lack of this integrating look I referred to before. So I believe it's something we need to strengthen. The decisions relating the transformation are based on science and evidence in the best scientific information available, either for the environment and what has to do with the climate system, but also what has to do with the human being and health, but because it is a planet and one health, we are part of the same system. Another important question regarding the conflict, what we mentioned before, is trust, generation of trust and liability. It is fundamental to build, strengthen institutional mechanisms of participation. We mentioned before the Estasub Accord. All countries have access to information. I think ParlAmericas has a network of open parliament to work these issues, the participation of the affected people, the communities, the vulnerable groups is important in this sense. I believe the conversation, the government, decision maker, community has to integrate the international principles, the accepted, international accepted principles, because we have the national framework, we have the international framework of the reports that we have seen of the National Secretariat of United Nations. We know we are doing bad. We haven't done a good job. More than 50% of the goals and sub-goals of the GDS are being undermined. The 7 targets in our region, for example, only 5 countries have systems of early alerts and information on integrated natural disasters. It is important to provide with a look to the principles and international commitments that we have facing the strengthening of that legal framework. And lastly, I don't want to go further, but the dialogue between the powers of state is basic. Also with the private sector to understand the needs regarding the distribution justice, the penal justice, regarding the change of use of soil mentioned by Eduardo. That is a serious problem. The assessment of environmental impact and what leads to that process. That is key, what you are doing here with the dialogue, parliamentary diplomacy. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are many things that are working, happening in the region that we could benefit from the conversation, dialogue, and lessons learned. For example, I took note of the new office in Canada on the multinational behavior of the companies. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much. And the way we adapt depends on how strong is governance and the particular legislation response. Thank you, Claudia. Enrico, I'd like to ask you, your organization as the OECD, the UN, recognized the just transition that really transforms the production and consumption model must pass through gender focus, taking into account the structural inequalities facing laborers and workers, despite the salary gaps, existing salary gaps that OIT calls sectorial segregation, factors that contribute to the difference of gender in number and quality of employment. How to generate the conditions to ensure that more women make the transition into green jobs, how to ensure that the jobs generated by green sectors are decent jobs.
Enrico.
You have the floor, Enrico.
Thanks. Well, yes, so the green transition is definitely like a wide-ranging transformation. Let me take, for example, the energy sector that's been mentioned by fellow panelists. If we take the renewable energy sector, so a segment of the broader energy sector, this is expected to grow a lot in the next few years. And if we analyze this growth from the point of view of female employment, then we see that this can create both opportunities and challenges as well. So on the one hand, the traditional energy sector, so the one based on fossil fuels, is a male-dominated industry, while the renewable segment has a more balanced gender representation. For instance, there's a survey carried out by IRENA that suggests that women compose on average 35% of the workforce in renewables, which is still not a lot, but it's quite a lot more than what you see in the traditional energy sector, where it's around 20 to 25%. So the more the renewable energy sector expands, the larger role women are likely to take. So these are good news in the sense of transition for gender and female employment. On the other hand, and this is exactly where the challenge lies, there are few data available, but they suggest that women on average account for half of the administrative position, but only for a third of the technical and management roles in the energy sector. So we see, gender segregation by job types, employment following gender stereotypes. There are a number of hypotheses that can be put forward for why this happens. One of them is that usually STEM education, that stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, tends to attract less women than men. And this underrepresentation in STEM education then is a likely barrier to higher female participation in the growing segment of the renewables in the green transition, but also in other sectors of the green transition. Of course, it's not a given that you have less women in the choosing a STEM tertiary education path, and a number of initiatives can be put forward to increase STEM education or making women more likely to choose this type of education. We have a number of examples in OECD countries. These include information campaigns in school and universities, the creation of mentoring programs, also opportunities for research scholarship, either in academy or in industries, or opportunities for vocational apprenticeship as well. At the same time, also let me also underline these other elements of the link between the green transition and gender balance of female participation in the workforce. There are a number of studies that suggest that the environmental footprint of firms is better when there is a more balanced representation of women in leadership roles. So the more women we can get in the green transition, probably also the faster is going to be the transition. Beyond being an employee, of course, you can also be an entrepreneur, can be a green entrepreneur. And there are also a number of barriers there as well to female entrepreneurship. I'm thinking, for instance, about the woman participation in the renewable energy off-grid sector, which is expected to be also an important segment of the green transition in several countries. At the same time, when we talk about gender dimension, transition is also like a second gender dimension. It is the workforce of extractive industries and energy utilities in general is largely composed by men. So the restructuring in these industries will have an impact in the first place on male employees. And then we might have knock-on negative effects on female employment. But basically the risk is that men might slowly crowd out female employment in other sectors. These are other aspects to take into consideration. In terms of decent jobs, as Samantha also mentioned before, but also we're curious to know her opinion as well, green jobs are not a totally new kind of job. So all policies that help to ensure good working conditions will also help to ensure that green jobs are decent jobs. Maybe I would just like to flag, since it's been mentioned also by the other panelists, Eduardo, for instance, the role of the mining sector. The green low carbon transition will probably lead to the growth of demand of several minerals that are key to green low carbon technologies. I'm thinking about the rare earths or cobalt and lithium for batteries. So these issues of mining jobs, ensuring decent condition in extractive sectors is something that also applies to the green transition as well. Thanks.
Gracias, muchas gracias. Samantha.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Now my question is for you. The way we have talked about an aspect when we generate the political consensus to go forward in the climate agenda, promote the ambitious goals, is to foster a social democratic, diverse social dialogue to call unions, government, groups of the civil society, which could be the role of the parliament in this social dialogue, of recommendations that you can share with you so that this dialogue be concrete, efficient. I would ask you to summarize to have more room for discussion. Thank you.
Yeah.
You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, two things. I mean, first, in the UN world and also in a lot of countries, at least for most jurisdictions, social dialogue is a very specific thing. It is employers and unions and sometimes governments. And then you will have a parallel process with stakeholders. So that would be civil society, organizations, communities, and so on. And in countries where you have First Nations, Native peoples, depending on the jurisdiction, they would be like a government and part of social dialogue. So just to kind of keep the definitions clear about what social dialogue is, it's not a multi-stakeholder process. It's a specific process with unions and employers and often governments, but at the same time, governments have to take responsibility for engaging this broad range of stakeholders. When we're talking about, and one last thing also about informal workers, indeed, as one of the fellow panelists said, The workers in many countries in Latin America, especially, are informal workers, which is a result of government policies. There's no two ways about it, and actions by employers. And many informal workers are organized. They're organized into associations. Some of those associations are our members or are affiliated with unions, but not all informal workers are represented in some way as a group. And so it is also in part our job as unions to speak for, to support, to try to organize people who today are not organized, because they need a voice in this too. I think the role of parliamentarians specifically in this process of social dialogue, I mean, Claudia was talking about the dialogue of state powers, and it's often the role of parliamentarians to be a questioning voice to the actions of national governments or regional governments. So it's entirely possible for parliamentarians to, for example, set up a hearing or a process of social dialogue involving unions and employers, calling people to the table and asking them to start to negotiate some of these plans for decent jobs. It's possible for parliamentarians to start a process of inquiry about a just transition plan for a particular region, because I completely support the points made by other panelists. You do need national action for just transition, but you need regionally specific plans, because that's often where you're going to have the biggest issues about jobs disappearing and decent new jobs needing to be created. So parliamentarians could play a role by calling together social partners, by calling together stakeholders in these two processes, or even just having a hearing to find out what is the plan, what are we going to do for people as they lose their jobs. I guess one last thing I want to say before we get into dialogue with you is that this is really urgent. Indeed, climate change is urgent, as some of the senators have already said. So we really have to get emissions down. And the consequence of that is that right at this moment, as we've already heard, people in the Colombian coal mining sector are losing their jobs. And there's no plan for people, right? There's no plan from the employer. There are no decent new jobs waiting for them. The solution for just transition, always in every country that we have ever seen, is two things. People need decent, good jobs to go to. You can't just say to them that they must go out into unemployment or into informal work. It is a recipe for disaster. And they need social protection, because all of the people who today are not in formal work or are not working at all for different reasons, age, illness, unpaid care work at home, all of those people need social protection. They need this floor that keeps households afloat while you're going through these really dramatic economic changes at a regional or at a national level. And parliamentarians can be a voice for these two things at the national level, but also calling on regional authorities and even employers to do their part. Thanks.
Gracias, Samantha. La última pregunta.
Thank you very much. The last question is for Eduardo. Of course, it's of utmost important for the countries of the Americas and the Caribbean when we speak about the effects of the climate policies on the workers, formal and informal, particularly those who work in the energy sector. As we have mentioned, the rural indigenous communities whose subsistence depends on the exploitation of these natural resources. Can you speak briefly about the situation, which could be the main recommendations for tackling the negative effects on the groups that I've mentioned? Again, the solution should be decentralized. You need to recognize the particularities of the culture, environmental, institutional, economic in each location. There is no recipe that fits all. In the case of informal mining of coal, where many workers are losing jobs, of course, the transition into a new work stage should be helped by the government. Training for the people, the creation of conditions, and regulation to favor the private investment on those regions where they are losing jobs, I believe is key. Those are decentralized policy decisions that do not apply to all the country. In the case of the communities that are self-employed in the ecosystems in the forests in Colombia, those are Afro-descendant citizens or Native Americans who live here in the woods, in the forests. Technology plays an important role. I think it is important the development of productive technologies and systems that allow at the same time the preservation of ecosystems and complementarily the generation of adequate income to those communities. Despite technological issue, it is a market issue too, to connect the communities to the regional and global markets. Even some of those communities, Colombia is working currently in the development of RED projects. I don't know if you know, it is the production of carbon with the preservation of the forest, the development of adequate economies, sustainable and economically efficient in those collective territories of traditional communities. I believe it is fundamental. I insist they should be decentralized policies to respond to the reality of each region, each case. Thank you very much. With this, we finish our 2 rounds of questions. I'd like to start our dialogue. Our experts, I'm sure, are interested to know our comments, approaches, the way the legislators address issues. Let us allow our panelists to ask a question. The one who would like to participate, please raise your hand with the icon to give you the floor. Enrico, do you have a question for us?
Yes, thanks a lot. It was a very interesting debate, and it's an incredible opportunity to have so many parliamentarians for the whole continent together. So the amount of questions one can ask is enormous. I will have probably just one question. We curious to know 2 things. What do you think is the main challenge for the just transition in your countries? What kind of policies are you trying to implement, but especially also how you see what is the role of the OECD, how the OECD could help in this context. The OECD is an organization focused on making policy research, but also fostering exchange of best practice, of knowledge, bringing countries together to exchange knowledge. So in this context, I was wondering, what do you see, which kind of elements, which kind of best practice you think the OECD could help to advance knowledge and facilitate sharing across countries?
Es que alguno de mis colegas quieren responder a la pregunta de Enrico.
Is there any of you that would like to answer to this question?
De mi lado, sí, Rolando Ruiz.
I see Rolando Ruiz. Rolando, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I'd like to start by greeting all of you and to tell you that from Peru, we send you the warmest regards. So very quickly, I'd like to mention that a couple of weeks ago, we had an incident in Lima, Peru, where we had something that has never happened before. We saw some thunderstorms and we had never seen that. And then we said that this is something that is due to the climate change, because pretty much the way that we're producing energy is what causing our nature to behave differently. So if we actually discuss this topic right now, if there is anyone that could explain why it happened, that'd be great. But I would also like to comment on what you were saying, that the use that we've had for our nature and our national policies have caused the consequences that we see nowadays. For a long time, we thought that the wooding industry would be the one that would cause deforestation. But by thinking in that way, by understanding the world in that way, whenever we thought that these companies leave no trees or no plants behind, we actually underestimate the, let's say, the regular person that works on the agricultural sector, because these people are the ones that can take care of, let's say, of those rural environments. We never thought about them, about being the ones that are taking care of our environment. They are the ones that try to preserve our wildlife and our plants, our vegetation, even at La Sierra. So I think that those natural phenomena that we have, such as the one that I described in Lima a couple of weeks ago. So what do you think is going on? So that's my question. Now we are going to move on to Rajendra Devi, who's got his hand up. So Rajendra, go ahead, the floor is yours. You're muted. You're muted. We cannot hear you. Please activate your microphone. Perfect. Thank you very much. Greetings from Suriname. When we talk about this climatic change incidents, we need to understand it holistically. We need to see the different initiatives that needs to be taken from the government part in order to see how the governance and the state or government can work jointly in order to have a peaceful society inside, so we can promote the sustainable development. Do you know what's the, I would like to know what's the opinion, what's Claudia's opinion on this aspect? So, Claudia, could you please answer to this question? Thank you very much, Senator. I completely agree with what you have said. To have a government, let's say a rightful and a fair government, I think that each one of the parts of the state or the government bodies have to comply with their mission. I usually use a Mexican example. In Mexico, we have the parliamentary officers who are the ones, or the policymakers that are the ones that have to establish new laws or new policies. So they need to be the ones that know what the problems are and why are we going to promote activities that are going to worsen the climate change that we have. After that, we have the executive body that is in charge of managing everything that has to do with the management. And finally, we have the judicial body that has to solve or that has to come to resolutions anytime that any of those policies are not complied with. So we had a situation with a water company in Mexico where they had some issue with some native peoples in Mexico, but in Mexico we had an issue with our executive body. So briefly, one of these parliamentary bodies had to actually ask the other body why they didn't comply with their mission. There was no regulation on the referendum that they wanted to have in this specific situation. So based on that, they had to change this regulation, but this pretty much helps us to understand. At the end, we actually figure it out, or we can manage the situation, but this helps us to understand what is the political control that everybody, every government body has in order to strengthen the government, let's say the government role in order to comply with the legislation, which is one of the main weaknesses that we have nowadays. Thank you very much. Now let's move on to Ariel Rodriguez, and then we go with Ganesh Mahipul. Perfect, thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking you. I want to express my gratitude because as a human being, I think that to big problems, big solutions, and I think that this generosity that we are trying to show today is an important step so we can actually solve the problems that we have nowadays. So the first question that I have goes to Enrico, and I think that the circular economy is key in order to advance. And I would like you to answer this question because OECD has been pretty much the engine of this vision. And I would like to ask you how Latin American countries can be helped in order to accelerate this circular economy vision. Of course, this is my presumption that this environmental issue cannot be solved if it is not addressed from the economical point of view. So I think that we need to think about development through different approaches. So the first question that I have for you, Enrico, has to do with the circular economy. And the second question, maybe it could be answered by Claudia or any other of the participants, has to do with the systemic nature of the climate change, where we need to actually deepen our capacity to establish discussions. And I think that in Latin America, we have serious democratic debts that we need to pay. So what do you think about the need and the pertinence of actually making our democracies to evolve in order to actually respond to the environmental issues that we have? Enrico, the floor is yours, and then we'll move on to Claudia.
Thanks. So yes, so the circular economy is definitely part of this debate. Is always a bit unclear where the low carbon transition ends and when the circular economy starts. Basically, the low carbon transition is part of the the low carbon transition is part of the movement towards a circular economy. It's a very broad question, and it's circular economy is a even broader transformation of our societies than just the low carbon transition. The key point with the circular economy is to make sure that secondary materials waste, what we usually call waste, becomes actually a good product, that its value is recognized. And there are a number of tools that can be used to design this. It's not only about the American countries, but the whole world, the constituencies. Something I think can be quite interesting is how also the role of trade and in the passage in transformation to a circular economy. International trade plays an important role in circular supply chains, because you want to have secondary products to be traded and brought them where they are most useful. So this, something that for the whole Americas, where you want to have increased economic interlinkages, that's something important, and a number of barriers are present usually in this case. Sometimes even within a more integrated economy like the European one, it's difficult to trade in secondary materials because they are considered just garbage waste that cannot be used. Something also which is important, I think, to the region in the context of the circular economy is that also in this case there is a role for the extractive sectors, in a sense. Some of the regions that are producers of minerals or primary materials, then once you introduce policy packages promoting the use of secondary materials, usually these primary materials becomes more expensive. Therefore, there is a risk of a decline in demand of primary materials. So it's a big challenge for a number of countries in the regions. So in this context, it's again the key challenge, if we go back again to the issue of an inclusive transition, is to make sure that the workers that are affected can then move to new jobs which are decent, which are good jobs, high quality jobs. And again, as I said before, policies that help to ensure that all jobs are good will help. We also have to ensure that the jobs of the circular economy transition are decent jobs. So again, the role of skills, the role of education. If we talk about the informality, has been mentioned several times in this debate. One example of interesting policy tools that can be used is the recognition of previous training to persons who were employed in an informal sector. We have some example, for instance, in the Flemish industries, where basically workers can take some tests, and then they will be issued a certificate that recognizes their specific abilities, and this will help them to find a more decent job in a greener circular economy.
Thank you, Enrico. I see that we have more questions and time is passing. So for the sake of giving opportunity to our legislators and Congress and senators to ask their questions, I will continue with Ganesh Mahil Paul. If you can ask your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and greetings from the beautiful South American country of Guyana. Currently, we have unprecedented heavy rainfall. This is currently the May-June period, and our country would normally experience rainfall, but today and probably a week back, we have had continuous downpour at as high as 8 feet, covering some homes. We had to evacuate people from the mining town of Linden, Kwakwani in specific, and there are a number of places across our country from region 1 to 10 currently underwater, and we're still trying to come to grips with that. Additionally, sometime last year during this very period, we saw some unusual high waves crashing over the seawalls, and 90% of our people, they live on the low coastal plain, which is below sea level. So with this climate change and the rise in sea level, Guyana is facing it very, very difficult. My problem, however, has to do with the government's response, and not just this government that we currently have, but previous governments too. And I think that fundamentally we have to look at our implementation, our national response, and the politics that comes with it also, because all political parties will seek to capitalize on these kinds of situations, which in my view is not right. But then that's a problem that we would find, and I'm not certain if other countries would have it, the response to these disasters and the implementation or preparation, if you know that it is going to happen, judging from what happened previously. So how do you treat the politics of the day versus the response mechanism and the preparation techniques for these natural disasters that can come from climate change? Thank you very much.
Ganesh, your question is directed to a specific panelist?
Anybody can answer it.
Okay. Any of our panelists would like to take that question?
Sure, I can give
yes.
it a shot if that's okay, Senator.
Yeah, please just try to be succinct because we have 4 people and I
Sure.
want them to give them the opportunity to ask their questions. Okay, go ahead.
So thank you very much, Senator. So what we're seeing, this goes also to the first question. As a result of climate change, we will see more severe weather events in every country, and some countries, including countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, are going to be really hard hit. So there's just no two ways about that. And you asked what national governments can do, what parliamentarians can do, what national governments can do to be ready for these disasters. And one thing is to have a national disaster response plan. And that also means beefing up public sector services for disaster response, everything from medical services and evacuation plans and services, all the way over to construction and reinforcement of things like seawalls. Those things, all of the things you need to do for disaster relief and response can also create a lot of good jobs. So it's important also to have the job creation part in mind. It's not just, you know, public expenditure, but it's also stuff that is going to get people back to work.
Thank you. So we're going to take 3 questions, if they can be quick and the answers can be succinct. First one will come from Omar Abed Maceda. Second one will be from Maritza Espinales, and we will end with Renee Cormier. Omar.
Gracias, muy buen día a todos.
Thank you very much. I'd like to extend my gratitude and to greet each one of our panelists and a senator from the Canada Parliament, Rosa Galvez, Enrico Bora, Claudia Winth, Samantha Smith, and also Eduardo Uribe Botero. Thank you very much for your very interesting remarks. As part of our vulnerable region, it is very interesting to actually listen to all of your remarks, because not all of our vulnerable population in each one of our countries are properly organized. And even within their communities, there is a lack of organization and a lack of belonging. I would also like to greet Senator Nancy de la Sierra and also Senator Beatriz Paredes, who's also joining us today. And I would also like to thank Miguel Saavedra, who actually invited me to this 5th meeting for the parliamentary meeting to discuss the climate change. So I would like to comment on the fact that we have the COVID-19 situation, and this is a clear example on how society and the different government bodies can actually work together with just one common objective. In this case, it was the healthcare. We know that there have been many different repercussions that has to do with all of the different aspects of our society. Now, having this global experience where we could see how all efforts can be addressed towards a single objective, we know that we can do it in order to fight climate change. Of course, we are going to join in further possibilities, in further opportunities, or in future opportunities. I'm sorry, I think we lost him. So now let's move on to Maritza Espinales, because I think this was not a question, but a comment. All right, Maritza, please, the floor is yours. Good morning, Mrs. Galvez. Good morning to all of our colleagues and especially our panelists. I would like to extend my gratitude to all of the topics that you have discussed, especially on the just transition. I'd like to say that in Nicaragua, has worked in coordination with the executive body, and we have reformed our environmental policy. This environmental policy, in its most recent reform, has incorporated the concepts and actions that have to do with climate change, environmental evaluation systems, sustainable consumption, clean production, and we have also created new instruments or new tools in order to manage our environmental resources. And there are also some environmental audit systems. And there is also an interinstitutional commission where we have the participation of the Ministry of Agriculture, the Agroforestry institution, the technological institution from our country, as well as the well-being institution from our country. And there is also the participation of one of the members of the National Assembly. We have approved, we have passed a law that has an implementation plan in both the plans from our parliament that has to do with the executive and legislative bodies. Within this initiative, we can see how climate change and the environmental policies are closely connected in such a way that we can show our commitment to fight this climate change from our government. One of the implementation plans that we have is that we want to reduce the waste of paper, and we want to reduce the use of paper down to zero, in such a way that we can show how we are trying to reduce the carbon footprint. And I would also like to congratulate on today's workers' side intervention, because workers are population itself. They are our people. And besides working with the parliament, I am also a professor at university. So with our parliament, we could see how the participation of unions in our country was more important. That's why we raised their participation both for the private and public sector. And on the other hand, from the informal point of view, we establish a further participation. So now they can participate within this policy making in our country, and now they are providing us with their insights on what their needs or what their opinion is regarding the different impacts that climate change may have on their lives. Nicaragua has also signed the Agreement 169 from OIT, and we have already implemented the referendum for our native people, so they can participate and we can work collaboratively, since we are committed to implementing reforestation plans. And we have already started with a generational approach. Our young people are participating through a specific institution in our government in order to help with this initiative, this reforestation initiative. So these young people can actually participate in recycling or reforesting, and the Nicaraguan government is absolutely committed to fostering this circular economy and this green economy. And all of our financial aids are actually focused on having more women participation. More than 50% of the different loans are in hands of women, both in the rural and the urban sector. Thank you very much. And I think that next time we should focus on the just transition, but what it has to do with the economics. And I think that especially in the Americas, all the 36 member countries should have a single voice on what has to do with climate change. Thank you very much, Senator Ramirez. Now let's move on to Senator Renee Cormier from Canada.
Good morning, buenos dias. Je vais poser ma question en français. Donc, je vais m'assurer que vous ayez bien accès à l'interprétation. D'abord, je veux remercier tous les panélistes et je veux remercier...
So I'm coming from Canada and I apologize. I'm going to do my presentation in French. Senator Galvez, thank you very much for your for this incredible opportunity. And let me tell you that this discussion today is giving me more questions. And now I have a question, a very general question. Right now, we can see how different populations are questioning their policymakers and their government bodies. And we can see how we're trying to fight these big industries. So as legislators, as policymakers, how can we contribute in order to be more reliable with our population, with our people, so they can actually take part on fighting these inequities in this climate change?
Je vois. Ah, Enrico? Oui.
Yeah, yes. Well, I think it's been mentioned by all the different panelists. Like it's very important that all stakeholders are involved in the process of the just transition, meaning labor, employers, but also the broader community. So the question, I think, in the context of making an inclusive green transition, the question is how we can create the right mechanism to listen to the need of the community, so making sure that all the different stakeholders have their voice heard. In this context, I think it's quite important to select the right communication channel. So I have to ensure that you are using the right channel to connect the right person you want to reach. Are the stakeholders you want to talk to reading the print press? They use website, they use social media. So which is the way you can reach them and engage them in the policy debate. Especially when we're talking about the transformation of regions, there is the studies that look at previous experience of industrial structuring. It's not the first time that we have some industries that go through hard times. And previous studies shows, or underline at least, that when there is a vision for the region, for the future of the region, which is shared by the key stakeholders, then a restructuring experience are more successful. So I think it's the idea of really engaging in social dialogue is very important.
Thank you. We have one last question from Michaela Huer, de Suriname. Michaela?
Yes, Ms. Rosa.
Yes, hello.
I hope you guys can hear me. I have some issues with my camera, so I cannot be, you guys cannot see me.
That's okay,
So
that's okay. We hear you well.
Okay. My question goes to Ms. Samantha Smith. Ms. Smith?
Yes.
Ms. Smith, I have a question. In Suriname, we also have heavy rainfalls, let's say the passing weeks, due to climate change challenges. We could almost speak of a small flooding in Suriname. Now, the rivers, even in the interior, are over their borders. It is a big challenge for the government to tackle these small natural disasters. When it comes to climate legislation to be adequate and implementable, I agree with Ms. Smith. However, I want to ask how other countries who are setting the best example in tackling these natural disasters, how they succeed. And for clarity, Ms. Smith, you talked about 5 countries who have the best example, if I am correct. So please, that's my question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. One quick thing, I mean, before the pandemic, the World Health Organization ranked countries on the basis of their readiness for a pandemic like this one. And the countries that were considered to be most ready, like the United States, turned out to be not ready at all, in part because of their national leadership. So, I hope you can take what I'm going to say in that context, that sometimes we think countries are really ready for climate change with all of their planning for natural disasters. And then it turns out that for different reasons, sometimes governance, they really aren't, and people are left vulnerable. Having said that, you know, the country of Bangladesh is uniquely exposed to impacts of climate change, especially, but not only because of sea level rise and flooding, and has a very well developed strategy for disaster response and adaptation. That strategy is in part funded through international climate finance. I think other countries that are pretty ready, especially for things like sea level rise, that would be the Netherlands. It's a rich country. They know that a big part of the country is under sea level. And so they've spent a lot of time trying to reinforce seawalls and barriers, build up coastal areas to bring more of the population out of danger. Beyond that, the countries that are working a lot on climate adaptation, but still in the planning stage. I know that in South Africa, the agricultural sector, like in most African countries, is extremely exposed to drought and to changes in rainfall, because most agriculture on the African continent is dependent on rainfall. So it's that through natural rainfall. So South Africa is also working on a climate change adaptation strategy for its agricultural sector. So just to conclude, I mean, there are examples. I'd be happy to provide more of them offline. But I think the main thing is one, to have a hearing with scientists about what kinds of impacts are possible. And that then helps the government to make a plan that really is going to have the country ready for all of the extreme events that you could face because of climate change.
Thank you so much. This was incredibly interesting. Fue muy grato, muy interesante. Muchísimas gracias.
It was interesting. Thank you very much for the experts and panelists who joined us to share your experiences with us. So we have finished a little bit late, but I believe it was worth it. We give the floor to the master of ceremony to continue with the program and finish the program. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, everyone, for a very rich dialogue. Senator Vieira, we noted you had a written question in there, and so we're going to work with the panelists to see if they can provide your response to that in writing, because of time, we just didn't have a chance to get to that. But I do want to take note that we did see that written question. Before I move to the next thing that I have to do, which is the way that we have to close up our events, I do know that I also had, though, a note here that I need to call upon Annabella Zavagno, who is supposed to give just share a comment that came from Mexico. Annabella?
Muchas gracias, Alicia. Así es como
Thank you very much. As you said, Senator Maria Merced Gonzalez from Mexico has asked for the floor because she had a comment, and unfortunately she couldn't join, but I will send the note, so I will proceed and read the comment. Good morning, panelists, parliamentaries, activists, and civil society. It is important as the international community we face the reality. The climate change increases inequality between the poor regions and the most developed ones. As the case presented by the research, read the estudios de desigualdades on the School of Mexico, refer to poor households exposed to the phenomena of climate change. In other words, the conditions of the infrastructure and households increase vulnerability and limit the capability to respond to climate risk of pollution and health.
existen zonas de sacrificio conurbadas a grandes industrias.
There are great areas, industry areas that use in the productive processes highly polluting practices for the air, soil, water, etc., CO2, organic persistent pollutant, urine, heavy metals are one of the names of those emissions derived from global warming that cause diseases from weakness of the bones, affecting the nervous system, cardiovascular, genetic malformations, and cancer in all the expression. Senator Gonzalez indicates that one of the proposals from the Mexican Senate is the call to stop the practices that affect the environment, like co-processing or burning solid waste, industrial waste carried out by companies that consider these practices as part of the production processes. To avoid these practices highly contaminant or polluting, she proposes as an alternative to carry out actions to promote circular economies such as the remanufacture, reuse, recycling, compost, and energy recovery of organic waste through biodigestion. Increasing energy saving, strengthening environmental education, and awareness to the problem we are facing as humanity. It's a moment to multiply efforts to help preservation of the planet and protect intelligently those who gives us life as a treasure for tomorrow that we are pushed to take care of today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annabella, for sharing that with us. Perfect. So I do, this is where I regret that we have these meetings on Zoom now, because if we were together, we would be moving into lunch and we could continue this great dialogue and we would have these discussions, and it's so rich. And I think there would be lots more opportunity for this. At ParlAmericas, certainly we took note that there is lots more opportunity for us to engage in this topic. We will have report come out of this session. This session will be made available for others to listen to or to go back to and refer to. We look forward to continuing to have a great long relationship, we hope, with Samantha Smith and Enrico Bota. I know we've worked with you before, and of course Claudia DeWind, and it was delightful to meet Mr. Uribe from Colombia as well, and we hope to continue with him. We do need to move, though, unfortunately, because we are over and this parliamentarians need to get to sessions and what have you. These are the notes we're getting. So we will be calling this to a close. And unfortunately meant that we didn't even get to have a real recap from our experts. So Samantha Smith, et cetera, we will take you up on your offers for, you will send information, or if people would like to exchange with you directly, we will definitely share contacts if that's okay. And I do hope that if you will agree to answer Senator Vieira's question that way, because it is actually a really interesting question. I'm so sorry it came in the chat sort of at this late time. We do have to do, our financing comes from the Government of Canada through Global Affair Canada. Everybody who works with ParlAmericas knows that this means that we also really have to make sure, we need to make sure that the activities we're getting a response back that you found the activity useful, that there was learning, etc. This is a part of our accountability at ParlAmericas. So we will be launching the famous ParlAmericas poll right now. It takes just a couple of minutes for you to please complete it. It is our evaluation. For our colleagues in French, if you would like to answer this in French, there is a link in the chat. That is the French version of the poll. For everyone else, English, Spanish, please go ahead. It is very short. I do urge you to please help us by answering this. This is a point of accountability for us vis-a-vis our funders. So I'll just give you a few minutes. It shouldn't take long. Perfect. While people complete that, I will now move to bringing us to the closing of this activity. So I would like to invite our board member from Nicaragua, a member of the National Assembly of Nicaragua, Maritza Espinales, to help bring us closing remarks here for this session today. Thank you. Diputada. Okay.
Gracias, Alicia.
Thank you, Alicia. Good afternoon, good morning. I share with Alicia. We are missing each other. We, on behalf of ParlAmerica, our Senator Blanca Avelar, our president, our vice president, receive our most sincere appreciation for having shared this first session of the fifth gathering addressing inequalities to foster the climate ambition in the just transition to reach the Paris Accord. We appreciate especially the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, the Senate of Mexico, for welcoming virtually this series of meetings. Thank you to my colleagues, legislators, and the parliamentary staff of the Americas and the Caribbean for joining in this event. Of course, the specialists who shared with us their experiences and knowledge. About the work of our network, I'd like to share with you a thought on today's activity for the Parliamentary Network of Climate Change of ParlAmerica. It's fundamental to offer our member dialogue spaces for the exchange of good legislative practices on topics that are in the avant-garde of the international agenda to fight the climate change. Regarding this, the climate action that is inclusive and democratic should be a main consideration in our legislation work and the climate plans in the short and long term started by our governments. About the session, as we have evidence on the first session, there are populations who are suffering the risks related to climate change in a different way due to the social differences, economic differences, cultural differences, ethnic and gender. This reality is particularly seen in the Americas and the Caribbean, where, according to the Inter-American Bank of Development, the marked differences regarding income are one of the many ways of inequality that undermine the social cohesion and belonging. Ethnicity, like income, are powerful determining factors for the access to the employment, legal system, and education. The complex relationship between the inequality and social discrimination interact differently, sometimes even simultaneously in different levels. It has to be acknowledged in the climate policies. Our climate plans should add necessarily intersectional approach and gender approach to account for the universe of inequality in such a manner that public policies to face the climate change not only offer the necessary socioeconomic response, but do not make worse the existing inequalities. As said by the report, the cross-cutting gender approach, public policies facing climate change in Latin America and CEPAL, the same answer to the climate change can foster inequality between men and women. If the gender approach is not considered in the design and implementation as a consequence, the traditional structural gender gap in the Latin American region can perpetuate. I'm convinced that today, with the help of guest specialists, we have a better understanding of the phenomena and better tools to enrich our legislation work to strengthen the climate mission along with the established goals in the Paris Accord. Next, events and closing. To finish, I'd like to remind you that within the framework of the fifth meeting of the Parliamentary Network of the Climate Change in ParlAmericas, we will hold two activities additional to the interparliamentary dialogue of today's interparliamentary dialogue. On Tuesday, 15th of June, we're going to have a dialogue with the representatives of the civil society, the youth of the Americas and the Caribbean, to explore with them mechanisms to strengthen their participation in the work of the parliamentary and exchange good practices to improve the public dissemination of this information. On Friday, 25th of June, we're going to have the plenary session of the fifth meeting of the network that will include the Master Conference, Luis Alfonso de Alba, Ambassador, Special Attaché for the United Nations for the Summit on Climate Change 2019. Additionally, we will hold elections for all the vacant positions of the Parliamentary Network of the Climate Change of ParlAmericas. So I encourage you to communicate with the legislation authorities to present your position. I'm sure that, as happened today, these sessions will open interesting instruments to enrich our work that should be the great challenge we face as a society to start without any delay the necessary action to mitigate the effects of the climate change in an inclusive way, democratic, without leaving anyone behind. I hope to see you in the next sessions. Again, thank you very much for your participation. And I remind you to access our website of ParlAmericas, where we have all our tools and events, previous events, to continue building the climate awareness. Good morning.